Most people think Roman soldiers were fueled by glory, marching in perfect formations, winning battles, conquering cities. They weren't. They were starving, sleep-deprived, freezing, and still expected to fight. Because the Roman Empire didn't run on discipline alone. It ran on men who knew how to suffer and survive. These were ordinary soldiers, marching 20 miles a day, carrying 60 pounds of gear, eating biscuits that broke their teeth, and drinking vinegar because water would kill them faster than a sword. They didn't get rest days, they got trench duty, no warm meals, no guaranteed sleep, just orders. And when the food ran out, they ate whatever they could find. This wasn't about courage, it was about endurance. We don't talk about this side of Rome, but it's the part that mattered most, because without these men, Rome wouldn't have lasted a year. So today, we're stepping into their boots, and it starts with what they drank. A sour, filthy mix of water and vinegar that tasted like punishment but kept them from dying first. They called it Pascha. It didn't taste like victory. It tasted like rot and rust. But Roman soldiers drank it anyway. Pascha, a mix of vinegar, water, and sometimes herbs, wasn't a luxury. It was survival, not wine, not clean water, just sour acid in a battered flask, swallowed out of necessity. Because in the Roman Empire, water couldn't be trusted. Rivers carried disease. Wells could be poisoned. Even rainwater spoiled in the heat. But vinegar? Vinegar killed bacteria. Vinegar kept men alive. Pliny the Elder and Vegetius both documented its use. Amphorae of vinegar were standard military issue, packed alongside grain and salt in every supply convoy. Once camp was set up, soldiers diluted it with whatever water they could find. Basin runoff, muddy streams, even melted snow. Sometimes they boiled the water. Most of the time, they didn't. The taste was awful. Veterans learned to stomach it. New recruits gagged, sometimes puked, but nobody wasted it. Not a drop. Because even if it didn't hydrate, it didn't kill you. And for a Roman soldier, that was enough. In a world where dysentery could wipe out a unit faster than an ambush, surviving the water was the first battle of every day. Pascha wasn't refreshing. It was reliable. It didn't have to taste good. It just had to be safe. This wasn't an option. It was an order. Officers drank wine. Everyone else drank vinegar. Not because it built strength, but because it kept death just far enough away to finish the march. Modern athletes sip electrolytes before a race. Roman soldiers choked down vinegar before drills. Same goal, different century, no mercy. They drank it because there was no alternative. Because thirst was just one more enemy. And because if you didn't drink, you didn't last. That was Pascha, a drink that punished the mouth but protected the gut. They drank vinegar to survive thirst. But what about rest? There was no rest. Roman soldiers marched day after day with no relief. 20 miles on foot wasn't a rare punishment. It was the standard. They carried 60 pounds of gear, weapons, shields, stakes, cooking tools, pickaxes. It wasn't optional. It was expected. The term for it was eater, the march. And in practice, it never truly ended. Once the march stopped, they didn't sleep. They built a camp from scratch. Trenches were dug, fortifications were raised, defensive ramparts went up around the perimeter. Then came food, if there was any. Then came rotating guard duty. Only after all of that could they sleep, and only for a few hours at most. Sleep didn't come with comfort. Most soldiers didn't have tents. If they were lucky, they huddled in groups of 8 called a contubernium, wrapped in damp cloaks, using shields for warmth and helmets for pillows. If fires weren't allowed, their only insulation was body heat. If someone failed their turn on watch, the punishment wasn't demotion. It was death. Fustuarium was one of the Roman military's most brutal punishments. If a soldier was caught sleeping while on duty, his own unit would beat him to death with clubs. It was a lesson to the group. Disobedience kills more than the one who disobeys. There were no excuses. You marched. You dug. You stood watch. You obeyed. Vegetius once said that discipline is the soul of the army. To a Roman soldier, that meant learning to sleep while walking, to doze with your sword still in hand, and to keep your ears open even when your eyes were shut. In the Roman army, sleep wasn't a right. It was a liability, and if you wanted to stay alive, you learned to survive without it. After the marching stopped and the guards were posted, soldiers had one question left. Was there anything to eat? Sometimes yes, but not always what you'd call food. Enter buccellatum, Rome's version of a hardtack biscuit. This wasn't soft bread or a warm meal, it was a survival tool, a block of baked flour and water designed to last for months without spoiling, but hard enough to break your teeth if you bit into it dry. This wasn't just a backup ration, it was often the only ration. Soldiers carried it in satchels, stacked like bricks. It was dense, flavorless, and virtually indestructible. Pliny the Elder and Cato the Elder both mention it as part of the standard legionary diet. If you tried eating it raw, you'd learn quickly not to do it again. Most soldiers had to soak it in water, wine, or pasca to soften it before chewing. If there was time, they turned it into a kind of mush or gruel. If there wasn't, they bit down and hoped. Veterans would crack it against the edge of their helmets. Others smashed it with rocks, anything to make it edible. But even when morale collapsed, buccellatum held firm, because it wasn't made for comfort. It was made for survival. This wasn't a ration that kept spirits high. It was a ration that kept bodies moving. Bread, in its soft and fluffy form, was for citizens in cities. For soldiers in the field, bread became a weapon. Heavy, dry, and almost impossible to digest. But it didn't mold, didn't rot, and didn't complain. Rome didn't feed its armies to make them strong. It fed them just enough to keep them from dying. And when buccellatum ran out, that's when the rules changed. Because after hardtack came desperation, and whatever you could find to chew next. When buccellatum wasn't enough, or was gone entirely, survival meant one thing: take what you could, wherever you could find it. Foraging wasn't a side activity. It was the Roman soldiers' fallback plan, and sometimes it was the only reason they made it through the campaign. Officially, soldiers were trained to live off the land, but in practice, that meant stripping entire regions bare. Wild roots were dug from the dirt, snails were eaten raw, dandelions, nettles, bitter herbs. If it didn't kill you instantly, it went into the pot. Caesar's Commentarii and Tacitus's writings both mention legions forced to survive on field forage alone. Entire campaigns operated without proper supply lines. Soldiers boiled bark. They roasted acorns. They dug up onions and yanked eggs from nests without asking. Sometimes they didn't even wait for the chicken to move. If you were near farmland, you took figs, olives, cabbages, unripe wheat, whatever grew. If there was a village, you emptied it. Rome didn't call this looting. Rome called it discipline. But for the civilians on the receiving end, it was theft, plain and brutal. Families would hide food in walls or bury it in cisterns. Some begged soldiers to spare a single sack of grain. It rarely worked. Commanders turned a blind eye. The army ate first, and when an officer cracked down on looting, it was usually because his own men weren't getting a fair share. The truth is, Roman soldiers weren't above stealing. They were trained for it, expected to do it, and if you hesitated, you starved. Foraging blurred the line between order and chaos. It wasn't just a tactic, it was a test. How far would you go to survive? And when even weeds, bark, and stolen cabbages ran out, that's when the stomach turned on itself. That's when survival meant chewing the unthinkable. When there was nothing left to forage, no crops, no bark, not even weeds, Roman soldiers turned inward. Not spiritually, desperately. They started eating their gear, boiled leather from sandals, tent straps simmered in filthy water, glue scraped from armor seams. Anything organic became food, or something close to it. This wasn't dramatization. This was documented starvation. During sieges like Jerusalem in 70 CE, Josephus wrote of Roman troops and trapped civilians alike boiling leather and gnawing on bones. Some even crushed bones to dust, mixed it with water, and drank the slurry. Not for flavor, for calcium. Sometimes they burned the bones to ash, stirred it into broth, and swallowed the bitter result. A desperate trick Galen called a phantom meal. No nutrients, just warmth and illusion. Grass was chewed to pulp, moss peeled from rocks, tree bark stripped down to the bitter white. Some soldiers swallowed small stones just to feel full until the bleeding started. They burned dung to cook weeds. They drank rainwater laced with ash. They fought over dead animals, not for meat, but for marrow. Starvation didn't just weaken the body, it unraveled the mind. Galen recorded hallucinations. Men saw loaves in their sleep, woke chewing their blankets. Others became catatonic, forgot names, dropped tools, sat down and never got up again. One soldier reportedly tried to eat his shield strap. Another tore open a pack of wax writing tablets, thinking it was dried meat. There was no dignity left. At that stage, food wasn't nourishment. It was whatever let your legs move for one more day. And even that wasn't guaranteed, because when a soldier's body broke, salt wasn't just seasoning. It was the one thing that kept their system from collapsing. It looked like dust, tasted like pain. But without it, you collapsed. Salt wasn't a luxury in the Roman army. It was survival, measured in pinches. A soldier could last days without bread, but lose too much salt and his muscles stopped working. His mind fogged. His heartbeat staggered. In a world of sweat, marches, and heat, salt was the invisible line between endurance and death. Roman commanders knew this. Salt was issued alongside grain and vinegar, sometimes as blocks, sometimes loose. Soldiers would scrape crystals into pouches or press salt to their tongues before a march to trigger thirst and retain hydration. Pliny the Elder didn't exaggerate when he called salt the noblest of all substances. Roman trade routes via Salaria were built around salt transport, fortified roads, guarded depots. Salt was so vital that to steal it was a military offense. In extreme heat, salt was the difference between a legion arriving intact or scattered along the road in collapse. Some commanders refused to move until a shipment arrived. They'd seen what happened without it and didn't want to bury another unit before the next camp. Salted foods were prized: cured pork, brined olives, pickled vegetables. Even garum, that pungent fermented fish sauce Romans loved, was mostly salt disguised as flavor. It preserved food. It preserved discipline. And when there wasn't enough, soldiers bartered gear for a handful. Others chewed salted leather or scraped mineral from rock. A few simply fell, twitching, confused, too far gone to even ask for help. Rome didn't see salt as seasoning. It saw it as control. Control over the body, control over the march, control over death. And if salt didn't save you, maybe sleep could, if Rome ever let you have any. Sleep wasn't warm, it wasn't private. Most of the time, it wasn't even sleep. Roman soldiers didn't get plush tents or cozy bedrolls. Most didn't get tents at all. Cloaks were their only blanket. The ground, their only mattress. If the weather turned cold, there were no fires. Open flames gave away positions. So unless they were camped somewhere secure, warmth had to come from the only source available: each other. Soldiers slept shoulder to shoulder, curled into tight rows, not for friendship, for body heat. The damp wool of another man's cloak pressed against your cheek was sometimes the only thing between you and hypothermia. The Roman military camp, or castra, followed strict geometric layouts: orderly streets, defensive ditches, and designated zones. But unless you were an officer, your assigned sleeping area was little more than dirt, marked by routine. A contubernium, a squad of 8 men, shared one tent if issued. More often, they slept in shallow trenches they dug themselves. Helmets were pillows. Shields were windbreaks. You learned to sleep with one hand near your gladius and one eye half open. Sleep came in pieces, interrupted by watch duty, barking orders, or the groans of someone else trying to shift a cramping leg. And yet, camaraderie formed here. Not in battles, but in shared silence under the stars. There were no words, just breath fogged in the cold, just exhaustion settled into bone. You didn't sleep well. You slept because your body had nothing left. And when dawn came, the fireless huddle broke apart. Sore limbs stretched, cloaks stiff with frost were shaken loose, orders barked, lines formed. No one spoke of the night, because there was no room for weakness, only movement, always forward. Even rest wasn't rest, and tomorrow held no promise of relief, only more cold, more marching, and maybe one illusion of comfort left: a fire. But even that came with a cost. They called it a rest day, but no one rested. You woke at dawn like always, ate hard bread like always, stood in formation like always. The only difference? You weren't marching, you were digging. In the Roman army, a day off didn't mean recovery, it meant maintenance. Camp needed reinforcing, trenches needed clearing, ditches had to be deepened, sharpened, rebuilt, blades dulled from marching had to be honed, shields rebound, sandals stitched. Everything was too worn, too dirty, too slow, and your hands were the solution. Some men cleaned latrines, others built ovens or fetched wood from miles away. If it had rained the night before, you scooped mud with a shovel until your knuckles split. If there'd been a battle, you buried the dead. Fire was allowed, not for comfort, but control. It kept men occupied. Fires flickered across the camp like reminders: you're still in service. You're still owned. The lucky ones guarded supply wagons or escorted officers. The unlucky ones were sent into nearby towns for forced requisition: food, tools, rope, anything useful. What they brought back wasn't always paid for. Rome called it resourceful. Locals called it theft. Letters might be written by firelight. Quiet conversations drifted between tents, but most sat in silence, not from discipline, but from exhaustion. And when night came, it wasn't peaceful. It was preparation for tomorrow. New orders, new miles, same cold cloak, same broken sandals. The word rest was a joke no one laughed at anymore, because the day you stopped moving, truly stopped, that's when the real damage began. And not in the body, in the mind. The Roman army feared many things: ambushes, plagues, mutiny, but nothing scared commanders more than a soldier who stopped responding. Not because he was rebellious, but because he was empty. They called it languor militum, the wasting of strength, will, and thought. Galen described it in his medical writings. Pliny the Elder hinted at it. It wasn't wounds, it wasn't sickness, it was collapse from within. It started with insomnia, not from noise, but from memory, marching in your dreams, fighting in your sleep, waking up to the same orders, the same pain, the same road. Then came the forgetting, simple tasks, names, the difference between today and yesterday. And finally, silence. Not discipline, detachment. The Romans had no word for PTSD, but they had fustuarium, a beating carried out by your own unit. Sometimes the man collapsing from mental fatigue didn't get help. He got punishment. Soldiers hid the signs. They forced smiles, repeated orders louder than they had to, tried to laugh even when they forgot what was funny. Some turned to superstition, scribbled prayers into shields, clutched amulets of Mercury or Mars, drank Posca laced with herbs to tighten the nerves. Others simply stopped. They dropped their gear in the middle of a march, sat down, didn't get up. One legionary was found chewing his own sandal. Another stared at a fire for 2 days, unblinking. There were no therapists, no leave, no relief. Rome didn't understand trauma, only utility. And once that utility was gone, you were left behind. Because in the Roman army, you didn't have to die to disappear. You just had to stop being useful. So what kept them moving? It wasn't motivation. It wasn't loyalty. It was something colder. Some called it discipline. Others, fear. But for most soldiers, it was momentum. The body learned to march even when the mind wanted to disappear. Roman training beat hesitation out of men. Vegetius wrote that discipline made the difference between an army and a mob. But what he didn't say? It also kept dying men upright longer than they should have lasted. Some legions marched on blistered feet, cracked ribs, and empty stomachs. One record from Germania describes soldiers collapsing mid-march and others stepping over them, not stopping. Because stopping wasn't allowed. If you broke formation, if you fell behind, if you hesitated, you risked the fustuarium. And if that didn't get you, starvation or exposure might. But not all men marched because of punishment. Some did it because it was all they had left. Brotherhood, habit, that strange military rhythm that said, 1 more mile, 1 more hour, one more breath. They weren't fighting for glory anymore. They were fighting because stopping meant disappearing. Not dying, disappearing. No record, no honor. Just an unmarked grave by the road. One historian wrote of Roman troops who finished a 20-mile march, built a camp, stood guard through the night, and fought a battle at dawn, all without food or sleep. No cheers, no monument, just survival. That's what the Roman Empire ran on. Not courage, not conquest, but men who were too tired to stop. The Roman Empire wasn't built on strength. It wasn't built on honor. It was built on men who knew how to keep walking when everything inside them begged to stop. They didn't have feasts or songs written in their name, no parades, no statues, no pages in history books, just blisters, broken teeth, and the will to keep moving. They drank vinegar instead of water. They chewed bark instead of bread. They slept in dirt, side by side with men they barely knew, and got up before sunrise to do it all again. And when they collapsed, Rome didn't pause. It stepped over their bodies, replaced them, kept marching. That's the legacy we forget. Rome didn't survive because it was glorious. It survived because its soldiers did. Just long enough to build the next road, fight the next war, hold the next line. So next time you hear about Roman greatness, remember what it really cost. And if you want more brutal truths from ancient history, subscribe and let us know which part shocked you most. Because here, we don't just tell history, we dig up the bones it was built on.